As the night enveloped the city in silence, Marco, a millionaire, drove his car without hurry, savoring the rare moment of calm. As he passed over a deserted bridge, something caught his eye. A huddled figure dressed in rags trembled under the dim street lights. At first, he thought it was just another forgotten soul on the streets, but something shimmered in the woman's hands. His heart nearly stopped when he recognized the bracelet, the same one his mother had worn for as long as he could remember. Overcome with disbelief and desperation, Marco pulled over and approached with tears in his eyes. He knelt before her, his voice came out weak, laden with emotion. Night slowly fell over the city as the street lights cast uneven shadows on the wet streets. Marco drove his car without much haste, enjoying the rare moment of silence in his hectic routine. But as he crossed a deserted bridge, something grabbed his attention. Under the dim light, he saw a hunched figure, almost indistinguishable from the decayed urban landscape. Marco slowed down and stopped the car by the curb, his eyes fixed on the woman whose presence seemed out of place in that location. She was crouching, trembling, her body wrapped in dirty rags, her face almost completely hidden by tangled hair, bowed low as if weighed down by years of suffering. Yet, something made Marco look closer. The woman held something in her hands, something that glowed faintly under a distant street light. His heart raced when he recognized the object. It was impossible. The bracelet, that same bracelet he had known since childhood, the one his mother always wore and never took off. A wave of disbelief and dread suddenly washed over him. He got out of the car, his mind spinning, struggling to understand how something so intimate and personal could be there in the hands of a strange woman. "Hey, are you all right?" Marco hesitated, his voice faltering as he approached. The woman didn't respond. He took another step, stopping when she lifted her head, her eyes squinting from weakness and cold. Then Marco's world seemed to collapse. The woman before him, covered in filth and neglect, was Sofia, his mother. "No, this can't be," he muttered, stepping back, shock written all over his face. Sofia blinked as if trying to recognize him, but her expression was confused, distant, as though she was trapped between the present and distant memories. Marco didn't know what to do. His mother had disappeared years ago without a trace. They searched everywhere, hired investigators, placed ads in the newspapers but never found anything. And now, here she was, a shadow of her former self, hidden under an awning on an abandoned bridge. How did you get this?" He pointed to the bracelet, his voice choked with disbelief. Sofia looked at the object as if only now realizing she was still holding it. Her trembling fingers caressed the cold metal, but she didn't respond. She seemed to be struggling to remember something, but her mind, fragmented by years of hardship, failed to connect the dots. Marco knelt in front of her, ignoring the light rain that had begun to fall. "Mom, is it you? How did you end up here? Where have you been all this time?" Sofia opened her mouth to speak but no words came out. She just shook her head slowly, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks, mixing with the dirt on her face. Marco, his chest tight with the pain of seeing her in such a state, took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Come on, let's get out of here," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He helped her stand, her movements slow and awkward, as if each step was a monumental effort. Slowly, he guided her to the car. Inside the car, Marco remained silent for a few minutes, just listening to the erratic breathing of Sofia beside him. She was bundled in his coat, her eyes fixed on the void as if she was stuck somewhere between the past and the present. "I need to understand what happened, Mom," he began, his voice low as he maneuvered the car away from the bridge. "You disappeared for so long, we thought you were dead." Sofia looked at him but didn't respond immediately. There was something in her eyes, a deep confusion, an internal struggle that seemed impossible to put into words. Marco knew the road to answers would be long and painful, but in that moment, he was just grateful to have found her alive. Marco could barely focus as he drove through the busy streets. The heavy silence in the car was suffocating, broken only by the muffled sound of the rain tapping on the roof. Sofia, his mother, sat beside him, wrapped in his coat, her gaze distant. Whatever had happened to her in the past few years had destroyed her from the inside out. Marco still couldn't believe what he was seeing. His mother, who had disappeared from his life, was now here, a fragile, unrecognizable woman. I don't know what to say, he whispered, as if speaking more to himself than to her. Sofia remained silent. Marco knew she needed help, and the first thing that came to his mind was to get her out of this deplorable situation, but where to start? He was filled with questions, anger for having been abandoned, and an indescribable anguish from seeing her in such a state. "We're going to my apartment," he said more decisively. "You can't stay on the streets, Mom." "I don't know what happened to you, but I'll help you, we'll figure this out together." Sofia stayed motionless, her eyes glazed as if trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Marco's heart raced as he drove through the avenues, trying to focus on the road, but the constant flow of thoughts distracted him. He couldn't stop wondering how she had gotten to this point. Memories of his childhood flooded his mind, the moments of happiness they shared, Sofia's easy laughter when he did something silly, the bracelet she always wore, a symbol of their family bond, all of that now seemed so distant. Arriving at his building, Marco parked and looked at her. "Let's go upstairs," he said gently, opening the car door to help her out. The rain had lessened, but the night's cold seemed to penetrate even deeper. Carefully, he took Sofia by the arm, guiding her inside the building. As they ascended in the elevator, Marco noticed how unsteady she was, as if her feet were unused to walking in such a clean and well-lit place. He held her firmly, but the sadness of seeing her so weakened was almost unbearable. "We're almost there," he whispered, "just a little further." In the apartment, Marco guided her to the sofa and helped her sit down. She seemed like a ghost of the woman he once knew. He rushed to get a blanket, and when he returned, he found Sofia staring at her trembling hands. The silence between them was heavy, but he knew he had to break it. He needed to understand what had happened. "Mom," he began, kneeling in front of her, "can you tell me what happened? Where have you been? Why did you disappear like that? I spent years looking for you." Sofia looked at him with a confused expression, as if trying to piece together a puzzle in her mind. "Marco," her voice was hoarse, almost inaudible, "I don't remember much. I just know that I ran away. I had to run." "Run from what?" he insisted, holding her hands. "What made you disappear, Mom? Who hurt you?" She shook her head, tears silently rolling down her dirty face. I don't remember, everything is so confusing. All I remember is that I had to leave, that there was no other choice." Marco felt his chest tighten, anger and despair mixed inside him. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to organize his thoughts. "We need help. I need to call someone to examine you, maybe a doctor, someone who can help you recover your memory." She clutched the bracelet tightly as if it was the only anchor still connecting her to reality. "This is all I have left," she murmured. Marco stopped. "That bracelet, you always wore it. It was a gift from Grandma, remember? You never took it off. How do you still have it? How is that possible?" Sofia looked at him but said nothing, her empty gaze like a black hole draining any hope of a clear explanation. Marco knew he wouldn't get answers that night. He needed help. Dante, his trusted friend who worked as a detective, would be the right person to investigate this. He picked up the phone and started dialing, but then he hesitated. "Dante can help us, Mom. He's discreet, and he can figure out what happened. You trust me, don't you?" Marco asked softly. Sofia looked at him, her eyes full of uncertainty, but slowly, she nodded her head. "I'll take care of you," Marco promised, his voice trembling. We'll figure out what happened, whatever it is, no matter how long it takes. He made the call, arranging for Dante to come over the next morning. As he hung up, Marco looked at Sofia again. There was so much to uncover, so many mysteries surrounding her disappearance, but above all, there was the promise of a new beginning. They weren't alone anymore. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through Marco's apartment curtains. The previous night had been long and restless. Sofia had fallen asleep on the couch, but her sleep was disturbed, filled with murmurs and whispers of a past that seemed to haunt her even in dreams. Marco, on the other hand, barely slept. He spent most of the night at his desk, going over old memories, trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. As he sipped his coffee, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the apartment. Marco quickly stood up and opened the door to Dante, his friend and private detective, who entered with a worried expression. "You had me worried last night, Marco," Dante said, patting his friend on the shoulder. "What's going on?" Marco closed the door and gestured toward his mother, still sleeping on the couch. "It's her, Dante. My mom. I found her last night. She was on the streets, in rags, and she barely remembers anything." Dante, with his investigative experience, observed Sofia from afar, his eyebrows furrowing in a mix of curiosity and surprise. "That's unbelievable, Marco. After all these years missing, she suddenly reappears. Something doesn't add up." "I know," Marco sighed, running his hands through his hair. "She can't tell me what happened, she only remembers fragments, like she was running from something, but running from what and why?" Dante walked over to the table and sat down, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Let's start from the beginning. You said she was wearing a bracelet." Marco nodded and showed him the bracelet Sofia still held tightly as she slept. "Yes, she never took it off when I was a kid. It was a gift from my grandmother. I thought I'd never see it again, but here it is." Dante took the bracelet, examining it closely. "This is more than just an ordinary piece of jewelry, Marco. It looks old, valuable. There could be more to it, maybe it's a clue." Marco, feeling on edge, sat down in a chair and rubbed his face with his hands. "I don't know, Dante. Everything is so confusing. She seems so broken, I can't stand seeing her like this." Dante placed the bracelet back on the table and looked directly at Marco. "She needs professional help, someone who can work with her mind, but I'll also investigate. There's something big here, Marco, and we're going to figure out what it is." Marco nodded, grateful for his friend's support. "She talked about running away, but running from who or what? I feel like the key is in the years she was gone." Before they could continue their conversation, Sofia began to stir on the couch, her eyes slowly opening, confused by the surroundings. Marco rushed to her side. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She blinked a few times, trying to adjust her eyes to the soft light in the apartment. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice weak. "You're at my apartment, Mom. You stayed here last night," he answered gently. "This is my friend Dante, he wants to help too." Sofia looked at Dante, but her expression remained distant, as if she were seeing everything through a fog. "I don't remember much," she murmured, "but there's this constant feeling like I've been watched for a long time, always running, always hiding." Marco and Dante exchanged a quick glance. This was the first time Sofia had spoken something more concrete, even if it was just a vague impression. Dante leaned forward, softening his posture. "Sofia, can you try to remember what happened? Anything, anyone?" She rubbed her forehead as if the battle against her own memories was unbearable. "There was a man, I think. A name, Giovanni Moretti." Her voice trembled as she said the name. "He wanted me gone. I knew too much, something I wasn't supposed to know." A chill ran down Marco's spine. Giovanni Moretti, the name resonated in Marco's mind like a ticking bomb ready to explode. Giovanni Moretti, who, what did you know? Sofia shook her head, clearly exhausted from the effort of trying to remember. I don't know anymore. Dante, with his experience, knew that pressing her too hard could do more harm than good. He stood up and looked at Marco. I think we have enough for now. Let her rest, and I'll start investigating this Giovanni Moretti. I'll be back with more information. Marco watched as Dante prepared to leave. Dante, thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you. We'll figure this out. Dante nodded. We'll figure this out, Marco. I'll start looking into this Moretti, he could be the key to everything. Marco couldn't rest, his mother's words echoed incessantly. In his mind. Giovanni Moretti. He didn't know much about the name, but the fact that his mother mentioned it in the middle of her chaotic memories and trauma made it clear that this was the thread he needed to follow. But who was Giovanni Moretti, and how was he connected to Sofia's disappearance? As Marco moved through the apartment, trying to organize his thoughts, Dante, on the other side of the city, was already taking the first steps in the investigation. The detective was known for his meticulous work and his ability to uncover hidden information even in the darkest corners of society. He knew the name Giovanni Moretti wasn't common, and soon he began pulling the first threads that could connect the name to some significant event in Marco's family's past. Later that day, Dante contacted one of his trusted informants, Mario, a man who knew what went on behind the scenes in shady business dealings. They met at a discreet cafe where no one would pay attention to two men discussing powerful names. Giovanni Moretti, Mario repeated, stirring his coffee slowly. That name isn't unfamiliar. I heard about him a long time ago, an old-school businessman, but you know how it is, he always had a foot in illegal stuff. Dante nodded, encouraging Mario to continue. And where is he now? Mario raised his eyebrows as if the answer was obvious. Disappeared. He vanished about 10 years ago. No one knows if he was killed, went into hiding, or just decided to change his life. But back then, he was known for shady business, money laundering, influence peddling, you know the type. Dante frowned. So, do you think he could still be involved in something even after all this time? Could be. No one just disappears without a trace. Someone like Moretti always has allies, people willing to keep his secrets, whether out of loyalty or fear. The detective thanked Mario for the information and left the cafe, his mind buzzing. If Giovanni Moretti was still alive or if someone was operating in his name, it meant Sofia had been running from something far bigger than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, Marco, in his apartment, was trying to calm Sofia down. She was agitated, pacing around the room like a shadow of herself, her hands still trembling. Even without saying anything, her eyes revealed that there was much more behind her silence. Mom, Marco called her softly, sitting next to her on the couch. I need you to trust me. Dante is investigating this guy named Giovanni Moretti, but I need to know more. Anything you can remember, any detail might help us. She looked at him with tired eyes, but there was a glimmer of determination on her face. Marco, I didn't want you to get involved in this. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the emotion was clear. I did what I did to protect you. It wasn't because I wanted to abandon you, I was trying to save our family, protect us from what? Mom, from who? She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as if she was struggling to piece together the fragments of her memory. Giovanni Moretti. He was a powerful man, he knew things that weren't supposed to be revealed. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and found out secrets I shouldn't have. He hunted me, threatened me. I ran away so he wouldn't find you. A chill ran down Marco's spine. His mother had been involved in something dark, and now it was coming back to haunt them. So, you ran to protect me? She nodded slowly. I knew that if I stayed, you would be in danger too. Moretti had eyes everywhere, he controlled more than we could ever imagine. Marco held his mother's hands, feeling how frail they were. But why now? Why would he let you come back to the city? Do you think he's still looking for you? Sofia lowered her gaze, uncertain. I don't know, Marco, but something has changed. Maybe he's forgotten about me, or maybe he's dead. But I've always lived with the fear that if he or his men found me, I wouldn't get another chance. Marco stood up, pacing back and forth, his mind racing. Then we need to act fast. Dante is already investigating Moretti. If he's still out there, we're going to find him, and this time, he won't hurt you. Later that day, Dante returned to Marco's apartment with a serious expression. I managed to dig up some information. Giovanni Moretti was a big player in the 90s. He had several shell companies involved in businesses that bordered on legality, but something big happened, and he disappeared off the map. That was about 10 years ago. The thing is, he had a lot of enemies but also plenty of allies, so if he vanished, it's likely someone else is in charge now. Marco clenched his fists, feeling the anger rising. So, that's it. He may have disappeared, but the legacy of fear he left behind is still out there. Dante nodded. We'll have to be careful. This isn't just a search for answers. If Moretti or anyone connected to him finds out we're investigating, it could put us directly on their radar. Marco looked at his mother, who sat silently on the couch, then back at Dante. No matter what comes, we'll see this through. I won't let my mother live in fear for another day. Dante placed a hand on Marco's shoulder. We'll find out what happened, and we'll take down whoever's still pulling the strings. The tension between Marco and Dante grew with each passing moment. The truth that was beginning to surface about Giovanni Moretti didn't just bring answers, it raised more questions, and the feeling that they were stirring up a hornet's nest intensified. Marco refused to leave his mother to her fate again, but he knew what lay ahead wouldn't be easy. Sofia, sitting at the table, fidgeted with the bracelet, the only object that seemed to link the present to the past. Her gaze was distant, but Marco knew she still felt threatened even if she couldn't remember everything that had happened. He couldn't blame her, the trauma she carried had fragmented her in ways he couldn't even imagine. After a long morning of research and phone calls, Dante finally received a new report. He walked into Marco's apartment, his face as serious as always, but there was something else, an expression of someone who had just uncovered an important piece. I have news, he said, pulling out a chair and sitting down at the table, facing Marco and Sofia. Giovanni Moretti may have disappeared, but I managed to track down some of his old connections. One of them was a man named Paolo Bianchi. He was a lawyer but also involved in several shady transactions. His name came up in multiple investigations, but curiously, he always slipped away without being indicted. Marco frowned. And what does he have to do with my mother? Paolo was close to Giovanni, and it seems that around the time your mother disappeared, they were involved in some kind of deal. We don't know exactly what, but I have reasons to believe Paolo was behind many of the threats made against your mother. At the mention of the name, Sofia slowly looked up, her eyes narrowing in recognition. Paolo, she murmured almost to herself. He was there, the last time I felt safe. Marco looked at her in surprise. You remember Paolo? She nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the bracelet in her hand. Yes, he was a constant presence by Giovanni's side. I knew he was involved in something big at the time. I started to realize something was wrong. Is that why you ran, Mom? I had no choice, she replied, her voice now steadier. They knew I had seen something important, something that could bring down Moretti's empire. I tried to keep my head down, but when Paolo came to threaten me, I knew I had to disappear. If I hadn't left, they would have killed me. Dante, listening intently to every word, interrupted cautiously. Can you remember exactly what you saw? What was the central point of those documents? Sofia closed her eyes, taking a deep breath as if she were trying to pull the memories back to the surface. I remember something about a network of people involved in illegal activities. It wasn't just money, there was information trafficking, things that could ruin powerful people. I don't know all the details, but I know Moretti was at the center of it all. Marco looked at Dante, his hands trembling with anger and tension. We have to find Paolo. If he's still out there, he could be the key to uncovering what happened to my mother. Dante nodded. I'm already on his trail. Paolo isn't active in business circles anymore, but I found out he's hiding out at a remote property. It seems he's been trying to stay out of the spotlight in recent years. If he's still involved with Moretti's old business, this could be our chance to get answers. Marco knew this could be dangerous, just bringing up Giovanni Moretti's name and his associates was risky, but now they were dealing with someone who held vital information. I'm going with you, Marco said, the determination clear in his voice. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Dante replied, frowning. If Paolo realizes we're investigating, he could disappear again or, worse, retaliate. I need to be careful dealing with him. I understand the risk, Dante, but this is personal. He threatened my mother's life, he forced her to live in the shadows for years. I'm not going to sit back and wait. Dante studied him for a moment, aware of how much this meant to Marco. Finally, he sighed and nodded. All right, but we have to be fast and discreet. If Paolo is still in contact with Moretti's old allies, we don't have much time before they realize we're around. As Dante mapped out the plan to track down Paolo Bianchi, Marco turned to his mother, who still seemed lost in her thoughts. We're going to fix this, Mom. I promise. No matter what happens, we'll uncover the whole truth. Sofia didn't respond immediately, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time. I just want it to be over, Marco, she said softly. I just want to live without fear. It will be, he assured her, gripping her hand firmly. That night, as the wind howled outside, Marco mentally prepared himself for what was to come. Dante had secured the coordinates of Paolo's property, they would head there the next day, hoping he would be the missing link to finally unravel the dark past of Sofia and the mystery surrounding Giovanni Moretti. But part of Marco knew this journey was far from over, every new discovery seemed to pull them deeper into an abyss of secrets and threats. Even so, he was determined to see it through, for his mother, for himself, and for all the years of suffering that could finally find some resolution. The next morning, Marco and Dante left early, leaving Sofia to rest in Marco's apartment. The night had been restless, the two men had barely slept, their minds racing with strategies and possible outcomes of the investigation. Now, however, they were on their way to the property where Paolo Bianchi was supposedly hiding. The drive was long, taking them out of the city and into a more isolated, quiet area. Dante was driving, and the silence between them was heavy, almost palpable. Both knew this mission was risky but necessary. If Paolo was still there, he could be the key to uncovering Giovanni Moretti's entire operation and, more importantly, Sofia's role in it all. Do you think he'll cooperate? Marco asked, breaking the silence. Dante kept his eyes on the road, deep in thought. Hard to say. If he's been on the run for this long, he's probably going to be suspicious. We'll need to be careful with our approach. If we push him too hard, he might shut down or even run. Marco nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility grow heavier with every mile that brought them closer to Paolo's property. His mother's life depended on what they uncovered there, and he couldn't afford to fail. Finally, after several hours of driving, they arrived at an old house, partially hidden by tall trees. The property was weathered by time, with peeling paint on the walls and an overgrown garden, completely overtaken by weeds. Everything about the place looked as though it had been abandoned, like the house itself was trying to hide from the world. "This is it," Dante said, turning off the car engine. The two men got out of the vehicle and walked toward the front door, their footsteps muffled by the eerie silence of the place. Marco felt a chill run down his spine. It was the kind of setting that only worsened their uncertainties. Dante knocked firmly on the door, and the sound echoed through the empty house. Nothing. They waited for a few minutes, but no one appeared. Dante tried again, knocking a little harder. Still no response. Maybe he ran. Marco muttered, frustrated. Dante glanced around and carefully checked the doorknob. It was unlocked. He exchanged a quick look with Marco, and they both knew they had to move forward. Dante pushed the door open, a long creak pierced the silence. They stepped inside. The interior of the house was just as run down as the outside. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and dust, and the windows, covered by thick curtains, kept the room almost completely dark. The house had clearly been abandoned for some time, but it didn't seem entirely unoccupied. There were signs of life: dirty coffee cups on the table, papers scattered across the floor, and a chair that looked like it had been moved recently. "He's been here," Dante whispered, his eyes sharp and alert. Marco's heart raced. If Paolo was indeed hiding here, he could be watching them right now. They needed to move fast. While Dante started searching the rooms, Marco walked into a small room at the back of the house where a bookshelf full of dusty books caught his attention. There was something strange about the room. It felt different from the rest of the house, more organized, as if someone had spent a lot of time there recently. He ran his fingers along one of the shelves, moving the books. One of them was slightly loose, as though it had been handled recently. When Marco pulled the book, a small compartment hidden behind the bookshelf was revealed. His heart pounded. Inside the compartment, he found a wooden box, old but well preserved. "Marco," Dante called from the other side of the house. "I found some notes that might be Paolo's." Marco, holding the box, rushed over to Dante. "I found something too," he said, raising the box to show the detective. Dante looked at it curiously. "Let's open it carefully." Marco opened the box. Inside there was a leather-bound journal, worn with age, and some folded papers with Giovanni Moretti's name highlighted in several places. Marco opened the journal and quickly flipped through the first pages. They were personal notes from Paolo Bianchi, detailing years of involvement with Moretti, but as he continued reading, one particular passage caught his attention. "Sofia Torres knows too much. She saw the documents linking Moretti to the information trafficking network. He asked me to take care of it, but I can't take that risk. If anything happens to her, the entire operation could collapse. I need to find a way to keep her silent without raising suspicion." Marco froze as he read those words. Paolo knew, he knew about his mother, about what she had discovered, and he was involved in all of it. The fact that he hesitated to do anything drastic to Sofia indicated that he was afraid of something bigger as well. Dante, reading over Marco's shoulder, slowly shook his head. "It seems Paolo was in the thick of it, and if he hesitated to hurt your mother, it's because he knew that any wrong move could draw attention to them." Marco slammed the journal shut, fury boiling inside him. So he ran. He knew the noose was tightening, but why didn't we find him here? Dante pointed to the papers scattered on the nearby table. He might have left in a hurry. These papers mention offshore bank accounts and properties abroad. It's possible he realized we were onto him and decided to disappear again. Marco was about to respond when he heard a noise coming from outside the house. Both men immediately turned, their senses on high alert. "Someone's outside," Dante whispered, moving toward the window. He peeked through a gap in the curtains and saw a figure moving away toward the nearby woods. "We've got company." Marco's stomach turned. "Is it Paolo?" "Maybe," Dante replied, already moving toward the door. Let's go after him. If he's around, we can't let him get away. They quickly left the house, but the figure was already disappearing into the dense vegetation. Marco and Dante ran, trying to catch up, but the darkness of the forest made the chase difficult. "Don't lose sight of him," Marco shouted as they ran, but the man was fast, and within minutes, he had vanished completely from their view. Marco stopped, panting, his heart pounding in his chest. Dante approached, equally exhausted. "He knew we were there," the detective said. "Now we know for sure that Paolo is still alive." Marco, still holding Paolo's journal, felt a mix of frustration and relief. "We have to find him. He's the key to uncovering my mother's entire past." Dante nodded. "Now that we know he's out there, we'll tighten the net. He won't run forever." Marco and Dante returned to the car with Paolo Bianchi's journal and their heads full of questions. Though they had found a crucial lead, they knew there was still a long road ahead. Paolo had escaped, and whoever he was, he knew they were on his trail. The mood between Marco and Dante was heavy as they drove away from the property in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Tell me what you think of the story so far, leave a like, and comment on what stood out to you, and where you're watching from. Marco thought to himself, as if he was narrating his own life, but he knew the real drama was far from over. Marco couldn't stop thinking about the words he'd read in the journal. His mother had been in a far more dangerous situation than he had imagined, tangled in a web of crime that extended beyond Giovanni Moretti. She wasn't just in danger because of what she knew but because simply being alive was a threat to these people. "We need to move fast, Dante," Marco said, breaking the silence as he looked at the journal he still held tightly. "Now that Paolo knows we're after him, he might try to disappear again. We can't let him slip away this time." Dante, always pragmatic, nodded. "I know, but for now, we have an advantage. This journal, it gives us a starting point, something concrete to track. Now that we know what was at stake, we can investigate the people mentioned here and find out who else was involved." Marco flipped through the journal again, this time more calmly. As he went through the pages, he began to notice a pattern. Several names were mentioned repeatedly besides Moretti and Bianchi. There were references to other associates connected to the information trafficking network and financial crimes. "Look at this," Marco said, pointing to a particular entry. "Here, Paolo mentions a man named Roberto Moretti, who seems to have been one of the main people responsible for managing the financial operations of Giovanni's network. He appears in several parts of the journal." Dante looked closely and frowned. "Roberto Moretti. I've heard that name before. He's a respectable banker in Milan, works with major corporations, but there have always been rumors that he's involved in shady transactions. If he's part of this, it explains a lot." Marco felt a chill as he realized how deep this scheme went. If this Roberto Moretti is part of the conspiracy, then we're dealing with a much bigger network than we thought. Giovanni wasn't just any criminal, he was well connected with influential people. "Yes," Dante agreed, "and now that we have these names, we can start pulling the strings that connect them. If Paolo hesitated to do anything against your mother, it's because he knew it would attract the attention of these other players. He was trapped in a dangerous web, and now we're right in the middle of it." As they were discussing, Dante's phone rang. He answered quickly, his expression shifting from seriousness to concern as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "I understand. Keep me updated." He hung up and looked at Marco, his eyes darker than before. "This isn't good. What happened?" Marco asked, already sensing that bad news was coming. "I just got a call from my contact at the police. There's been an attack at the house of one of Moretti's former associates, a lawyer who was involved in some of his schemes. He was found dead this morning." Marco felt a chill run through him. "Do you think it's connected to what we're investigating?" "Definitely. It's too much of a coincidence to be isolated. Paolo is on the run, and it seems whoever is still in control of this network doesn't want to leave any loose ends. They're eliminating anyone who might know too much. That means my mother is still in danger, Marco murmured, the worry evident in his voice. Dante nodded but tried to reassure him. She's safe for now, they don't know we've gotten this close. But you're right, we need to move fast. We'll have to make sure your mother is protected while we push forward with the investigation. As they drove back to the city, Marco felt the tension growing. The danger surrounding his mother was far greater than he had imagined. Giovanni Moretti and Paolo Bianchi weren't just isolated criminals, they were part of something much bigger, a conspiracy involving powerful men with vast resources. He knew they couldn't trust anyone but themselves. Back at Marco's apartment, Sofia was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes downcast, clutching the bracelet she hadn't let go of since it was found. When she saw her son enter with Dante, she looked up, clearly worried. "What did you find out?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marco exchanged a glance with Dante before sitting next to his mother. "Mom, we need to talk. We found proof that you were being watched and threatened by Paolo Bianchi and Giovanni Moretti, but it's more than that. There are others involved, powerful people who don't want the truth to come out." Sofia seemed to shrink at the mention of Moretti's name as if the memories tormented her. "I tried to run from them. I thought if I disappeared, they'd forget about me." "I know, Mom, but now we know that Paolo is running too. He was involved in everything, but it seems he was also afraid of something bigger." Dante stepped closer, speaking with his usual calm. "Sofia, do you remember someone named Roberto Moretti? He was one of Giovanni's associates, it could be important if you know anything about him." Sofia closed her eyes, trying to pull some useful detail from her fragmented memories. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes slowly and whispered, "Yes, Roberto. He was in charge of handling the money. Everything went through him. Giovanni trusted him more than anyone else. I saw him many times, but I never fully understood what they were doing." Marco felt the weight of the revelation. They were surrounded by powerful, dangerous people, and now that they knew too much, their lives were at risk. Yet, he was determined to see this through, not only to protect his mother but to ensure that those responsible were brought to justice. "Dante," Marco said with determination, "we have to track down Roberto Moretti. He might be the next target or the next one trying to cover all this up. If we find out what he knows, we can bring down this network once and for all." Dante nodded. "I'll start tracking his movements. If he's still active in Milan, we'll have a chance to find him before he disappears." 2. Sofia looked at Marco, fear evident in her eyes. "Marco, please be careful. They're dangerous. I don't want you to get hurt because of me." Marco held his mother's hands and looked her straight in the eyes. "Don't worry, Mom. I'm going to end this. We'll get through this together." As night fell over the city, Marco and Dante knew they were closer to uncovering the full truth, but they also knew the danger was greater than ever. The network of Giovanni Moretti was beginning to unravel, but there was still much to be revealed and many people willing to do anything to keep those secrets buried. The clock on the living room wall showed almost midnight and Marco and Dante began mapping out their plan to locate Roberto Moretti. Milan, with its luxury corridors and high-class business dealings, would be their next destination, but they knew the man they were searching for wouldn't be easy to find. If Moretti was involved in Giovanni's illicit transactions, he likely had layers of protection and allies willing to cover his tracks. "He'll be well guarded," Dante said, studying a map of Milan with several marks on it. "Moretti has a facade of respectability. He's the type of man who uses the law to his advantage while conducting the dirtiest deals behind the scenes." Marco, seated at the table, couldn't take his eyes off Paolo's journal, which was now one of their biggest sources of information. "If we find him, this could be over. Dante, my mother can finally live in peace." Dante nodded, but his expression was grim. Yes, but we need to be cautious. We don't know how far Moretti's allies reach. If we strike too soon, he could disappear, or worse, retaliate before we have the evidence. With the plan set, they left for Milan the next morning. The city, with its elegance and frenetic pace, contrasted with the tension Marco carried on his shoulders. Every street, every corner seemed like another obstacle on the path to the truth. Dante had secured a contact with a former associate of Roberto Moretti, someone who, behind the scenes, could provide leads on the banker's whereabouts. They met in a discreet restaurant in a quieter part of the city. The contact, a middle-aged man with a nervous look, introduced himself as Johnny, an accountant who had briefly worked with Moretti before leaving the business out of fear of getting involved in something too dangerous. "I won't lie," Johnny began, stirring his coffee slowly. "Moretti is smart, very smart. He doesn't leave a trace, and even when things start to get dangerous, he has an incredible ability to slip out of trouble." "And now, where is he?" Marco asked, his impatience evident. Johnny looked around as if afraid someone might be listening. "In recent months, he's been keeping a low profile, but I know he's still managing some discreet operations. If you want to find him, there's a chance you could catch him at the Palazzo d'Oro. He goes there to conduct business with entrepreneurs, but I'll warn you, he's not alone. Moretti is always surrounded by heavy security. If you make the wrong move, it'll be over." Dante thanked Johnny for the information and paid for the coffee before they headed to the car. "This confirms what we suspected," Dante said as he drove through the streets of Milan. "Moretti is operating in the shadows, but he's still a big player. If we catch him at the Palazzo, we need to be prepared for the worst." Marco took a deep breath. He knew that confronting Moretti wouldn't be easy, but it was the necessary step to end all the pain and fear that had haunted his mother for years. That night, as he planned for the confrontation, he felt closer than ever to finally understanding the whole puzzle. The next morning, Marco and Dante arrived at the Palazzo d'Oro, an imposing building that exuded power and exclusivity. The place was bustling with luxury cars constantly arriving and leaving. Outside, security guards patrolled the entrance, alert to any suspicious movement. They needed to get in discreetly. "We'll blend in as two regular businessmen," Dante said, adjusting his suit as they merged with the crowd. "The key is not to raise suspicion until we're close to Moretti." They entered the building without any problems, but now came the hardest part, locating Moretti. The main hall was packed with important people, and security was scattered throughout the place. Marco tried to stay calm, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the man they were hunting. After a few minutes, Dante nudged Marco's arm and discreetly pointed. There he was. Roberto Moretti was seated at a more secluded table, talking to two serious-looking men. He seemed confident, carefree, as if nothing could touch him, but there was something about his posture that suggested he was always ready to act. Marco felt his anger rise as he looked at the man who had likely put his mother in danger all those years ago, but he knew he couldn't act rashly. If Moretti realized they were after him, he could escape again or, worse, alert his allies. Dante made a subtle gesture for Marco to stay calm. "We need evidence, Marco. We can't just confront him here. If we go after him without concrete proof, he'll walk free and disappear. Let's try to get closer and listen to what he's saying." They slowly moved toward the table, blending in with the other people in the hall. Now they were just a few meters away, close enough to overhear part of Moretti's conversation. He was talking about investments and transactions, but his language hinted at something darker behind those deals. "The funds are ready," Moretti said to the two men, "but we need to move fast. We can't let Giovanni Moretti's name get tied to these operations. Too many people are watching us already." Marco froze when he heard Giovanni Moretti's name. So he was still being mentioned even after all this time. That meant the criminal operations were still active, and Moretti was at the center of it all. We need to record this conversation, Marco murmured to Dante, who was already discreetly positioning his phone to capture the dialogue. If we can tie Giovanni to these transactions, we'll have the proof we need to take Moretti down. The conversation continued with Moretti mentioning a series of illegal transactions involving offshore accounts, falsified documents, and bribes to major corporations. He spoke so casually that it was almost impossible to believe he was talking about serious crimes. Suddenly, Moretti stood up. I think this meeting has gone on long enough. Let me know as soon as everything is finalized. Marco and Dante knew this was their chance. If they let Moretti go now, he might disappear for a long time. They needed to act. We'll follow him, Dante said as they quickly moved out of the hall before Moretti noticed them. They followed him down a corridor toward a side exit where they saw him approach his car. Their plan had worked up until this point, but now came the decisive moments. Just as Moretti was about to get into his car, Dante stepped forward. Mr. Moretti, he said firmly. Moretti stopped mid-motion, his eyes narrowing as he sized up who was addressing him. Who are you? Marco, driven by years of pent-up anger, stepped forward. We're the ones who are going to make you pay for everything you've done, Moretti. We know about Giovanni Moretti. We know about my mother. Moretti stood still for a moment, his expression shifting to a mix of shock and anger, but then he gave a cold smile. You think you can touch me? You think you can take down someone like me? We have the evidence, Dante said, holding up the phone that had recorded the conversation. You're not getting away with this. For a brief second, Moretti's face twisted in fury. He stepped back, trying to get into the car, but before he could move, the security around him noticed the tension. Within seconds, the situation exploded. Moretti was surrounded, and Marco and Dante were forced to back off. Justice will catch up to you, Moretti, Marco shouted as they were pushed back by the guards. Moretti got into the car, but before driving off, he shot one last look at Marco. You don't know what you've got yourself into, kid. This is far from over. As the car sped away, Marco felt the adrenaline begin to fade, but his resolve remained strong. They had lost the chance to capture Moretti in that moment, but they had the evidence. The final showdown with Roberto Moretti was only just beginning, and Marco knew it was now a matter of time before the truth came to light. Back at the apartment in Milan, Marco was restless. The recording Dante had managed to capture at the Palazzo d'Oro was an important piece, but it wasn't the final blow. They had enough evidence to tie Roberto Moretti to illegal activities, but they knew this was just the tip of the iceberg. The web of corruption and crime surrounding Giovanni Moretti and his associates ran deep, and they would need more proof to take down the entire operation once and for all. Moretti knows we're close, Dante said, his eyes fixed on the laptop in front of him. He's going to start covering up everything he can now. He'll move money, erase trails, and even use his allies to throw us off course. We need to act fast. Marco, pacing back and forth, stopped and looked at the detective. We need to expose this to the public. We can't rely on the authorities alone. If Moretti or any of the others have contacts inside, they can manipulate the system and get away with everything. Dante considered the idea for a moment before nodding. You're right. We need a dual approach, find more evidence that directly links Moretti to Giovanni and spread the story as widely as possible to make sure that once it's out, it can't be silenced. As Dante worked on the files and prepared the recording, Marco picked up the phone to call his mother. He felt a growing anxiety about her safety, now that they were directly confronting those involved. He knew the danger was greater than ever. Hi, Mom, Marco said when he heard Sofia's tired voice on the other end of the line. Is everything okay over there? Sofia responded with a soft but worried tone. I'm fine, Marco, but I'm worried about you. This confrontation with Moretti, what are you going to do now? We got the evidence, Mom. We recorded Moretti talking about the transactions and mentioning Giovanni's name. It's the beginning of the end for them, but we need more. They can still try to escape. Sofia paused before replying. Marco, there's something I haven't told you. When I worked for Giovanni, I saw something that always terrified me, but I was never able to prove it. Something like what? Marco asked, his heart racing. Sofia sighed. Documents. They were coded, but I managed to get a copy of some of them. I never thought I'd need them, so I hid them. They're stored in our old house, Marco. I've never gone back there, but I believe they're still in the basement. Marco was silent for a moment, absorbing the information. Coded documents, this could be exactly what they needed to bring down Moretti and the others involved. Mom, these documents could be the key to ending this once and for all. I'm going there now. We'll find them. After the call, Marco explained everything to Dante, who quickly agreed to accompany him. They knew time was running out, and if they didn't act fast, Moretti might try to cover everything up or disappear for good. That same night, Marco and Dante set off for the old Torres family home, a place Marco hadn't visited since his teenage years, long before his mother disappeared. The house was abandoned, covered in dust and silence, as if the years of neglect had left deep marks on the walls and furniture. Every corner seemed to carry a piece of Marco's past, memories of happier times but also the emptiness that followed Sofia's disappearance. Do you know where the documents are? Dante asked as they walked through the living room, illuminated only by handheld flashlights. In the basement, Marco replied. My mom hid them there before she disappeared. If they're still there, we have a chance to end all of this. The basement was dark and smelled of mold. Marco knelt down and started pulling out some old boxes, rummaging through items that had been left behind. After a few minutes of searching, he found what he was looking for, a metal box, locked and hidden behind some old furniture. This is it, Marco said, a mix of relief and apprehension in his voice. With some effort, they managed to open the box. Inside was a pile of papers, yellowed with age, and a small notebook, clearly filled with coded notes and numbers. Dante carefully flipped through the documents, examining the information. This is much more than we expected, he said, his eyes wide. These papers directly link Moretti, Giovanni, and other big names to secret accounts and illegal transactions. This is explosive. If we release this, there's no way they can escape. Marco looked at the papers and felt a surge of emotion. They finally had the missing piece to bring down the criminal network that had tormented his mother and destroyed so many lives. Now, it was just a matter of exposing the truth. We're taking this to the press, Marco said, determined. With this, we can destroy not just Moretti but Giovanni's entire dirty legacy. As they left the house carrying the documents, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. They had the evidence, now it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. But as they moved away from the house, Dante suddenly stopped, looking toward the end of the street. Two black cars were parked there with their headlights off but clearly waiting for something. We've got trouble, Dante whispered, pulling Marco behind the house's fence. I think Moretti found out we're here. The cars sat idle for a few seconds before the doors opened, and three men got out, dressed in dark suits, their expressions hard and focused. Marco's heart raced, they needed to get out of there before they were spotted. Looks like Moretti isn't taking any chances, Dante murmured. We need to leave now. If they get those documents, it's over. With the men closing in, Marco and Dante began to retreat on the opposite side of the house, moving quickly and quietly. Adrenaline surged through their veins as they tried to escape unnoticed. The men were getting closer, but Marco knew they couldn't lose those documents. It was the final blow that would bring down the entire operation. Carefully, they managed to get far enough away to reach the car hidden on a side street. Dante quickly accelerated, and the two disappeared into the night with the precious documents safely stored. "We made it out," Marco said, breathless. "But they're after us. We need to move fast." Dante, with his eyes fixed on the road, nodded. "Tomorrow, we'll hand these documents over to the press and the authorities. We'll make sure the whole world knows what Moretti, Giovanni, and their associates have done. They won't escape this time." As they drove back to the city, Marco felt a mix of relief and tension. The end was near, but there were still obstacles to overcome. The truth was about to be revealed, and he was determined to make sure no one else suffered at the hands of Moretti and his network. The next morning began with tension in the air. Marco and Dante prepared for the decisive moment, delivering the documents to the press and the authorities. The truth was in their hands, but they knew that Roberto Moretti's men were lurking, ready to retaliate if they sensed any real threat to their operation. Even so, they couldn't wait any longer. What was at stake was much bigger than themselves. It was Sofia's life and the lives of many others who had been affected by years of corruption and violence. With the documents securely stored in a briefcase, Marco and Dante made their way to a major TV station where renowned journalist Sandro Mancini had already been contacted. Mancini had a history of investigative reports and was known for exposing large-scale criminal schemes. He was the ideal person to bring the truth to the public without fear of reprisals. As they approached the station building, Marco looked at Dante, trying to hide his apprehension. "Are we sure Moretti can't interfere with the press?" Dante nodded, but his eyes remained alert on the road. "Moretti has power, but not enough to control large-scale public exposure. Once these documents are made public, he won't be able to hide." When they arrived at the station, they were greeted by Mancini and his team. The seriousness of the situation was clear, and the atmosphere was charged with urgency. The journalist shook hands with Marco and Dante firmly. "Thank you for trusting me," Mancini said as he led them to a secure room. "You've got something big here, and we'll make sure the public knows the whole truth." Marco opened the briefcase and handed the documents to Mancini, who began flipping through them, his eyes widening as he read the undeniable evidence linking Moretti, Giovanni Moretti, and a series of other influential names to a web of corruption, information trafficking, and financial crimes. The detailed notes, transaction records, and secret bank accounts were enough to destroy Moretti's entire network. "This is explosive," Mancini said, unable to hide his surprise. "We'll release this immediately. The weight of this evidence will shake the foundations of several powerful organizations." As Mancini prepared to launch the report, Dante received a phone call that made him tense. He stepped away to answer it, and when he returned, his face was serious. "We've got a problem. I just got word that Moretti found out about the imminent release. He's on the move." Marco felt a chill in his stomach. "What's he going to do?" "He'll probably try to flee," Dante replied. "He knows that once this information goes public, there's no way out. He might be trying to leave the country right now." Mancini, overhearing the conversation, spoke firmly. "If he tries to flee, Interpol will be on him. We'll broadcast the report live on all channels. This will put pressure on the authorities to act quickly." Within an hour, the report began airing. Roberto Moretti's name, once synonymous with power and influence, was now associated with serious crimes like money laundering, bribery, and involvement in information trafficking networks. The public exposure was massive, and the news quickly spread across international media. The incriminating details of the documents Marco and Dante had recovered were everywhere, and Giovanni Moretti's name, despite having been dead for years, was back in the spotlight, along with the revelation that his network was still active. The response was swift. Within hours, Milan police and international agencies began to act. Arrest warrants were issued, and raids began on several properties linked to Moretti and his allies. Marco, watching everything unfold on the station screen, felt a mix of relief and anxiety. The evidence was now out of reach for any cover-up attempts, but Moretti was still free. "We need to make sure he's arrested," Marco said, looking at Dante. "If he escapes, he could try to rebuild everything somewhere else." Dante was already one step ahead. "Interpol is aware. They've issued an international alert. It won't be easy for him to disappear this time." The following hours were a whirlwind of events. Moretti attempted to flee the country but was intercepted at Milan airport where Interpol agents detained him before he could board a private jet. Press cameras captured the moment he was handcuffed and taken into custody, his once unflinching face now twisted in a mix of anger and defeat. The case of Roberto Moretti and his entire corruption network was exposed beyond reputation. With the evidence in hand, authorities began dismantling the operation, and several other arrests were made. Moretti's and Giovanni's associates were tracked down and brought to justice as Giovanni Moretti's dark legacy finally came to an end. But for Marco, the greatest victory was seeing his mother finally free from the nightmare. Sofia, who had spent years running and hiding, could now breathe a sigh of relief. When Marco returned home, he found her in the living room, watching the news with a deep expression of relief. She turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. "You did it," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You finally pulled me out of the darkness." Marco approached and hugged her, feeling the tension of years begin to dissolve. "We did this together, Mom. You're the true survivor here." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the magnitude of what they had faced and overcome sink in. All the pain and fear they had carried for years were finally beginning to fade, and for the first time, Marco felt that the future was finally open to them. In the days that followed, the press continued to cover the dismantling of the corruption network. Moretti was brought to trial along with the other members of the operation, and the gathered evidence ensured they were convicted. Justice had finally been served. Marco and Dante watched the trial unfold with a sense of accomplishment. They knew they had risked a lot, but they also knew they had achieved something great. "It's over," Dante said as they watched the final broadcast on the case. "Finally, they've paid for everything." Marco nodded, looking toward the horizon. He knew the battle had been tough, but now the future seemed full of possibilities. His mother was safe, and the truth had prevailed. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he was at peace. "So, you've stuck with us through this wild ride of uncovering secrets, facing dangers, and seeking justice. If this story grabbed you, hit that like button, leave a comment about what you felt or thought, and share this with someone who loves a good tale of redemption and revenge. And remember, stay tuned for more epic stories because the next one is just around the corner, ready to blow your mind." The aftermath of the trial brought a new kind of peace to Marco's life. Sofia's health slowly improved as the weight of fear and secrecy lifted off her shoulders. She began to reconnect with the world, finding joy in simple things like walks in the park and spending time with her son. Marco watched her transformation with a heart full of gratitude, knowing that every smile she gave was a testament to their hard-fought victory. Marco and Dante, having become closer through their shared ordeal, decided to start a foundation dedicated to helping victims of organized crime. Their aim was to provide support, legal aid, and safe havens for those who had been silenced or overlooked by society. They called it the Light of Truth, a beacon for anyone looking to escape the shadows of the criminal underworld. Meanwhile, the media frenzy around the Moretti case didn't die down quickly. The story of a millionaire uncovering his mother's past and dismantling a criminal empire was the stuff of headlines and documentaries. Marco found himself occasionally in front of cameras, not because he sought the spotlight, but because he wanted to inspire others to stand up against injustice. One evening, as Marco sat down to write his journal, reflecting on the journey that had changed his life, he realized how much he had grown. From a man driven by personal vengeance to someone who sought broader justice, his perspective had shifted. He wrote, "Today, I looked at my mother, and for the first time in years, I saw not just the scars of her past but the healing of her spirit. We've turned our pain into purpose, and in doing so, we've not only liberated ourselves but lit a path for others. This isn't just our story, it's a beacon for anyone who's felt powerless, showing that with courage and support, darkness can be overcome. Dante, who had become like family, often visited. They would sit by the fireplace, discussing future plans for their foundation, sharing laughs, and sometimes, in the quiet moments, they would just sit in silence, content with the peace they had achieved. One day, while organizing an event for their foundation, Marco received an email from an unknown source. It read, "Marco, your story has given me the courage to speak out. I was once like your mother, hidden and scared. But now, thanks to you, I see a light at the end of this tunnel." Anonymous. This message was one of many that Marco would receive over time, each one a reminder of the impact their work had. It fueled his resolve to continue, to ensure that no stone was left unturned in the fight against corruption. Years passed, and the foundation grew. Sofia, now an active member, found a new purpose in counseling others, helping them rebuild their lives. Marco, on the other hand, kept his business running but with a new ethos, ensuring that his wealth contributed to society rather than just his own gain. One significant evening, Marco and Sofia were invited to speak at a global summit on human rights. Standing before an international audience, they shared their story, not as victims but as survivors who had turned adversity into advocacy. The applause was thunderous, not just for their courage but for the hope they represented. As they left the stage, Sofia took Marco's hand, her eyes gleaming with pride. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" "Further than I ever imagined," Marco replied, squeezing her hand. "And we'll keep going, Mom. Together." That night, they walked back to their hotel, the city lights reflecting in their eyes, symbolizing the many lives still to be touched, the many stories yet to be told, and the endless fight for justice that, with every step they took, seemed just a bit more within reach. And so, the story of Marco and Sofia became not just a tale of uncovering a dark past but a narrative of hope, resilience, and the unyielding human spirit. Their journey was a testament to the fact that even in the darkest times, the light of truth can prevail, guiding us to a brighter future. End of story. Remember, if this journey has resonated with you, leave a comment, like this video, and share it with someone who might need to hear this story. And don't forget, there's always another adventure waiting for you right here on this channel. Stay tuned, stay inspired, and keep fighting the good fight.